speaking to one of the most memorable experiences you've had with nature. Yeah.
I think there's something about megafauna which touches us very deep, which triggers what I consider to be a ghost psyche, which is vestigial psychological equipment which we evolved, which helped us to survive in circumstances very different to our own. And so when we encounter very large animals, particularly unexpectedly, it creates a thrill of recognition, of engagement, of delight that we sometimes don't even know is there until it's triggered. And I think the most powerful example for me was when I was out in my kayak in Cardigan Bay. I used to live not far from the coast there. And it was a stupid day to go out, like a lot of days when I went out on my kayak. There was a 10 or 12 foot swell. It was getting pretty nasty. And I decided it was time to come home. And on my way back, I realized that as the tide had risen and the waves had risen, there weren't many options for getting in that these big waves were now smashing against the sea wall. And so I was sitting a few hundred meters offshore, just wondering what I was going to do, and suddenly heard this great hiss behind me, which I assumed was a wave about to break over my head. So I sort of flinched, and nothing happened. It was weird. What the heck? What's going on? So I was sitting there, and suddenly this great hooked, scarred grey fin rose immediately under my paddle shaft and came up until it very nearly touched the paddle shaft and then sank again. And I knew what it was, and I knew it was fine, but there was this sort of immediate adrenaline thrill. I was already quite tense because of the situation and this sort of not really knowing how I was going to land. And this intensified it further. And then suddenly I heard that great whoosh noise again, and I turned round, and it was this bull bottlenose dolphin, about the length of my kayak. It's a 13-foot kayak, and it's a really big one. It's a huge bull dolphin. Came clean out of the water and leapt right over my head. And as it came down on the other side, it looked back for just an instant and caught my eye. Out of the corner of its eye, it was looking straight into my eye. And then poof, it was gone. And it was that moment of profound connection and total clarity. It had come out of nowhere, as far as I was concerned. It was completely unexpected, though looking back I realized that the previous noise I'd heard was the bull breaching right behind me, but I hadn't realized. And it lent me this clarity which enabled me to see what I hadn't seen before, that there was a little slitway halfway down this sea wall, and that there was enough of a gap between the waves that if I was fast and clever, I could leap out of my kayak onto that slitway before I got smashed against the sea wall. And it was almost as if the dolphin had given me that, just that. It was as if my perceptions had cleared through that extraordinary moment of connection. And that moment lives in me still. There's not a year in which I don't recognize it and remember it and come back to it several times in the course of that year as one of the formative moments of my life.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I equally used to work in the bush, well I still work in the African savannah, and have had many deep experiences in that way too. And so it's just really nice to hear that story. And I think just something I want to kind of move towards is storytelling and communication. I've just spent a week at Wildscreen talking about all sorts of things with regards to what commissioners and people would like to share in the media. And I just would love to get your thoughts on, like, communication and storytelling, and how important that is at this moment in time.
So everything we do should be informed by fact. It should be informed by data, informed by numbers, informed by the best possible knowledge we can acquire of what's going on in the world around us. But data and numbers never persuaded anyone to change their minds. And while they are absolutely crucial, and any of us with the time and the inclination to inform ourselves should take that opportunity to do so, it's our civic duty as citizens to be as well informed as we can. If we're trying to persuade other people, we need more than numbers, we need more than data, we need a story. And not just any old story either, we need a story that follows the narrative structure that has been decisive in just about possibly every political or religious transformation in human history, as far as we can tell. And that's a narrative structure I call the restoration story. And people say, well, there's 3 basic plots, or 5 basic plots, or 7 basic plots, always an odd number for some reason. But this is one of those basic plots that everybody recognizes as a basic plot. And the structure goes like this. The world has been thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious forces working against the interests of humanity. But the hero or heroes confronts those powerful and nefarious forces, against the odds overthrows them, and restores harmony to the land. It's a Bible story. It's a Lord of the Rings story. It's a Narnia story. It's a Harry Potter story. You'll recognize that narrative structure again and again and again. And it is also the overwhelmingly powerful political story. If you can tell that story, regardless of what your politics is, regardless of where on the political spectrum you sit, if you can tell that story, then you equip yourself with the most powerful of all political tools to achieve change. And people of my persuasion have been really bad at telling that story, really bad at finding a way to explain what we want, to explain how we see the world changing that conforms to that narrative structure. It's not difficult to do. We just haven't recognized it as a necessary task. And ecologically, you can tell that story very well. The world has been thrown into disorder by the powerful and nefarious forces like the fossil fuel industry and the banks and animal agriculture and the other industrial forces which are ripping our living planet apart. But the hero or heroes, who are the environmentalists and all those that they can attract to their cause, will confront those powerful and nefarious forces, and if we get together in big enough numbers, as Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future and many others are doing, we can, against the odds, overthrow them and restore harmony to the land. And harmony looks like, to me, rewilding, ecological restoration on a vast scale, undoing the great damage that we have done, bringing back the rainforests and the savannas and the wetlands and the mangroves and the seafloors and the kelp forests and all the other crucial ecosystems upon which Earth systems and our own lives depend. That's a restoration story. It's not hard to tell.
Thank you, George. It's as a storyteller, it's always it's always great to speak about the power of storytelling and the impact that it can have in what we're trying to achieve collectively and collaboratively. And would you be able to speak a little just to how you see rewilding as a defined term and restoration as a defined term?
So rewilding is a young word, but it's already got many meanings. And I embrace most of the meanings. I think that it's a very useful word. I mean, as well as rewilding ecosystems, I feel I've rewilded my writing. I've quite deliberately tried to let it find its own way to a greater extent than I'd done in the past, not to structure it so much, to see where a thought and investigation might lead me, and then follow that rather than trying to impose the more rigid framework on it that I did in the past. I've sought to rewild my own life to some extent. I want to rewild my children, though they're slightly resistant to the idea. But originally, and most importantly, it means the mass restoration of ecosystems. And I feel that within the word rewilding is an implicit assumption about scale. It's not just about making your garden a bit shaggier. It's about trying to change things on an ecosystem-wide scale. It's trying to restore systems across a large area of land or sea. And the importance of that is that, you know, we are dealing with massive complex systems. Everything that's important to us, from the human brain and the human body up to the oceans and the atmosphere, with all the ecosystems and human society and everything else in between, is a complex system. And complex systems operate on vast scales and vast time scales, but can rapidly accelerate towards collapse. And unless we operate on a vast scale in trying to push them back away from the brink of collapse, we're going to lose. We're not going to succeed. Earth systems will collapse. And rewilding is one of those crucial tools for pushing us back into a safe equilibrium state, for ensuring that those complex systems don't come closer and closer to the tipping points beyond which they collapse into a new equilibrium state, which is not the one in which we evolved and the great majority of life on Earth evolved. So rewilding means thinking big. It generally means front-loading your interventions, taking down the fences, filling in the drainage ditches, reintroducing missing species, maybe planting islands of trees just to get the process going. But then, to the greatest extent possible, standing back and letting nature do what it does very well, which is self-organization. Being a complex system, an ecosystem is self-organized. And if all the components are there, including the top predators, which are often extremely important for the organization of ecosystems through the trophic cascades which they trigger, if all those components are there, nature looks after itself very well. It doesn't need our constant intervention if the areas are big enough and it's got everything it needs for its functional dynamics to proceed.
And with regards to the coexistence story, so I think, like, to be able to engage with mass ecological restoration and rewilding of species throughout Africa, South America, and parts of the world, I mean, some of it's preservation, I guess, before restoration, which is what we're seeing in Africa at the moment. A lot of wilderness needs to just be preserved.
Yeah. Yes.
And I guess, and then there's this coexistence story where we're filming elephants coming into agriculture, and that coexistence story. So I'd love to ask sort of a question regarding how do we engage with coexistence at scale with wildlife? What sort of tools, what sort of, how can we engage with this at scale, with whole communities specifically?
Yeah. So rewilding is only going to work if it's done with people, not done to people. Done with the free, prior and informed consent of the people who already use the land and are engaged with the land. And so it's essential at all times that you build the project, whatever project you're building, with the local community, and that there's something in it for them. In fact, something better in it for them than business as usual. That you're changing things for the better for people, as well as for ecosystems. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence that you can make a lot more money from a nature-based economy, that there are better incomes to be had, there is more employment to be had than from a lot of traditional land uses. But people need to be persuaded of that, not just with words, but actually with proper contracts and proper long-term plans where there's trust. They know that they're going to be the beneficiaries and not some distant entity. They know that you mean what you say because you can't get out of the contractual obligations you might have. And I recognize that, you know, nothing, you can't nail down the future. You know, there might be another pandemic which stops the tourist industry dead, for example. So while you can't absolutely guarantee that something is going to unfold as you might predict, you can give people the best assurance that you can within the noisy world in which we live. And you know, I don't blame anyone for resisting rewilding if they don't see what's in it for themselves. But I think there's a very powerful case to be made that you can greatly enhance rural livelihoods, as well as enhancing the survivability of humankind as a whole, through changing from a traditional land-based economy or sea-based economy towards a nature-based one.